Chrollo Lucifer and Queen Oito of the Kakin Empire are related. Not only that, but they're brother and sister related, so like really related. This would make 14th Prince Wobble Chrollo's niece, and it would also make future family gatherings incredibly awkward because new Uncle Kurapika is responsible for killing two of Uncle Chrollo's best friends, primarily due to the fact that Uncle Chrollo brutally murdered Uncle Kurapika's entire clan for the purpose of selling their body parts to third Uncle Saradnik. That's right, we have triple uncle action happening here in a situation that the Spanish would refer to as a classic La Batalla de los Tres Dios Extraños. I know, it sounds stupid, not the Spanish, the theory. All Hunter x Hunter theories sound stupid out of context. There is no exception. Phaeton is a Zoldyck, Pariston is a Sheila, Killua is part cat person from the Dark Continent. They're all mind-numbingly dumb until you hear the evidence. And this is no exception, so let's see how it works. In chapter 350, 8th Queen of the Kakin Empire, Oito, reveals that she was born in extreme poverty with 4 siblings, 2 older and 2 younger. However, King Nasubi discovered Oito and became enamored with her, or more accurately, his little Nasubin became enamored with her, and then he whisked Oito away for a life of luxury. However, we see a brief flashback of Oito's home featuring 3 obscured children, who look shockingly similar to the Phantom Troop flashback in chapter 102, wearing the same style of outfits, one of whom is thought to be Chrollo. This is helped by the common assertion that Meteor City is likely very close to the Kakin Empire, and that we've even seen potential evidence of Saradnik's tattoo artist abducting children from Meteor City. In addition to this, Oito and Chrollo look stunningly similar, featuring the same eyes, the same hair color, and most importantly, both possess a naturally genius level of intellect. Now, as we know, Chrollo grew up to be something of a naughty boy, conducting some genocide here and there, thus starting Kurapika on his path, and the two are now converging once again, with Kurapika rather fatesomely becoming the bodyguard of Chrollo's alleged sister and alleged niece, with the aim of protecting both from yet another naughty uncle, 4th Prince Saradnik. That's the general gist of things, and I think it's a fun thought. If it were true, it creates this superb drama, because it puts Kurapika in this almost Shakespearean style scenario. You know, the whole, I have been charged to protect the family of the man who murdered my family. So there's a lot of potential for some nice full circle narrative. Because I've often thought that, even with this idea put to one side, the succession war is going to culminate with Kurapika making a decision. And that decision is either going to be giving into vengeance and taking revenge for his dead clan, or managing to escape the cycle and prioritizing the future of the living, aka Little Babby Wobble. And a relation to Chrollo would make that choice much more powerful. And the great thing about something like this is that the characters themselves don't ever necessarily need to find out. So many great tragedies bank on the idea that only the audience has the full information. So on the one hand, Kurapika has reached the end of his quest with Saradnik. All he needs to do is recover the remaining eyes and his life's purpose is fulfilled. So perhaps there will be a classic situation where Kurapika can only choose to save one, either the eyes or the baby. Again, it's a lovely idea, and I think it's a great avenue to really dig deeper into Chrollo, as well as directly bring him into the meat of the succession war. But how sound is the idea? To start with the inciting incident, let's examine these 2 flashback panels a bit closer. With the Phantom Troop one in particular, this was something of an enigma for many years, until chapter 396 finally revealed that these 3 figures running with the tape are indeed Chrollo, Franklin, and Shalnark. In both panels, the kids are dressed very similar, and it could be some sort of epic Togashi foreshadowing connection. But in reality, 2 of the kids are dressed very differently. The one who would represent Franklin has long sleeves, and the child representing Shalnark, I believe, is actually a little girl wearing a dress. However, the Chrollo child matches both of them well enough, meaning that we could say, no, this may not be the troop, but this could be Chrollo's original family. All of the siblings that Oito mentioned. I mean, yes, it's a big stretch, but it's far from the biggest problem with the theory. Because something else this idea leans pretty heavily on is that the Kakin Empire is quite close to Meteor City, and therefore easy to pick up people, kind of like going down to your local human grocery store. And this is because, in my opinion, one of Togashi's greatest weaknesses as an author is depicting space and time. He is phenomenal with characters and concepts, however, the reality of the world is something often ignored, and it can lead to misconceptions like the following. The Kakin Empire is often connected to Meteor City because we actually first visit the Empire at the beginning of the Chimera Ant arc. It's where a company takes Gon and Killua to meet Kite, who was hired by Kakin to conduct ecological research into their native, significantly smaller and much more manageable Chimera ants. The really big ants, of course, ended up in NGL, and then shortly after, Zarzan and some of the others take up residence in Meteor City. So the logic here is that Kakin is close to NGL, which is close to Meteor City. And in the manga, Gon, Killua, and Kite do travel from Kakin to NGL in a couple of pages, so it does give the impression that they're right next door. But they're actually on completely different sides of the world, because the Queen's Arm was found south of York New City, which is the European continent. Meanwhile, Kakin is on the Asia continent. continent. And given that the Chimera Ant outbreak was restricted to this bottom left sector of the world, it's safe to assume that Meteor City is also on the Orbian continent and therefore nowhere near Kakin. Is this a problem for the theory? Not really. Meteor City's location doesn't matter because it's still a global hub. People travel there from all over the human realm to engage in all sorts of illicit activities, whether that's kidnapping children or sourcing wives. In fact, one of the most prominent cases of wife sourcing comes from the Zoldyck family. Kikyo Zoldyck was originally a resident of Meteor City before she was selected to marry into the assassin family. Furthermore, the Zoldyck employees, Goto and Canary, were also acquired from Meteor City. The reason why I imagine this is a good idea is because for people in desperate situations, their loyalty is pretty cheap. Characters like Goto and Canary would and have given their lives for the Zoldyck family due to their simple act of elevating their own lifestyles. And the same can be said of Kakin Queens. In fact, whether it's Meteor City or not, this exact thing did happen for Oito. Nasabi found her in a slum, best described as somewhere, and I don't see it as too far out of the question for him to have taken a trip to Meteor City to go people shopping. A slightly trickier concept is proving any sort of blood connection between Chrollo and Oito. Because yes, they do look alike, however I don't like using aesthetics to prove anything. It's mostly important to mention to highlight the fact that they don't look radically different and just not related at all. But other than that, What hits me a lot harder is how much they share intelligence. Chrollo is obviously one of the greatest minds of the series, and Oito, all things considered, is not far off. In fact, Oito's introduction into the series was tricking Kurapika into thinking that he was actually meeting with 9th Prince Hawkenberg. Oito fooled Kurapika, like fooled him good, and that's a very understated achievement. And throughout the war, she has been consistently sharp, recognizing that during the meeting with Zhangle, that Kurapika's explanation of Nen was much more for her benefit than for his, and even pinpointing with terrifying accuracy Kurapika's intentions with Prince Saradnik. On one occasion, even questioning his strategic motives by saying, "Start with Saradnik. Is that for your convenience?" The fact that with no education and a lifetime of poverty, Oito is still this intellectually gifted is wild. And it's a much more solid connection to Chrollo than fictional aesthetics. However, for this to work, we would probably need to imagine that Chrollo is the older brother. And we do know that he is somewhere between 28 to 29 years old. We also know that his height is 177 centimeters tall and he weighs 68 kilograms, which according to the BMI calculator makes him a very, very healthy boy. Meanwhile, Oito's age is unknown, and we don't know exactly how old Wobble is either. However, if I were to guess, then I would say young, mostly due to the whole being a baby thing. This is important because it means that Oito would have been recruited for general queenliness fairly recently in the grand scheme of things, and therefore, if any of this was true, would still have been a resident of Meteor City as recently as 1 or 2 years ago, which makes things a bit less believable because Chrollo is depicted as an orphan in all Phantom Troop flashback media. I guess it's never explicitly stated, but it is heavily implied. Or at the very least, it would be quite the retcon for him to have had like 3 sisters and a brother for this entire time. So the idea would then need to become that Chrollo is not one of Oito's 4 known siblings, and perhaps he's an estranged older child that was dumped in Meteor City by their parents for whatever reason. Maybe they couldn't take care of him, maybe they sold him, whatever, it happened. And then his eventual sibling still grew up in poverty, but not like Meteor City levels of poverty. And at this point, I'd also like to briefly linger on the very first panel we see of Queen Oito. Absolutely beautifully drawn by Togashi. You can really sense the desperation and terror on her face, but what captures my eye even more is the framed portrait of King Nasabi in the background. When I first saw this, I went, hang on a second, I know that image. And it's because it's a blatant copy-paste from chapter 340, where Nasabi gives his big dark continent speech, which makes sense from a manga-making perspective, because Togashi's health only gives him so much ability to draw, so reusing images isn't quite as taboo as many mangaka often view it. But from an in-world perspective, it's pretty funny, because it means that that picture was printed and framed within like a day. King Nasabi saw himself on the television and said, "Damn, I look good. Have that picture framed and send one to each of my 8 wives so that they can also appreciate my majesty." Which isn't too hard to believe coming from a man who televised himself on a blimp, which I refer to as the Nasu blimp, and weirdly enough, it actually quite suits him because his natural figure greatly resembles a blimp as it is. Alright, sorry for the tangent, I've just never had any reason to talk about that and I had to get it out. But let's get slightly more serious, because to me the be-all and end-all of this idea really comes down to Togashi's connection with poverty. As much as Hunter x Hunter has radically changed as a series throughout the last 2 decades, Togashi does stay consistent with a handful of themes, one of which is the commentary on extreme wealth and extreme poverty. After a certain point, most arcs in the series contain a core element of wealth inequality, such as York New City with the hyper-wealthy mafia families engaged in all sorts of unsavory body part dealing versus the come-from-nothing Phantom Troop. Meanwhile, the entirety of Greed Island is set into motion by a multi-billionaire who learns that all of the money in the world couldn't buy the one thing that he truly wanted. During the Chimera Ant arc, we have very obvious commentary with the political structure of East Gorto and the dictator Ming Jol-ik, and now the Kakin Empire, well, that should be pretty obvious as well. All of that was a very long way of saying that Togashi has very strong ideas about wealth inequality, and as a result, he often portrays poverty. He portrays it a lot, and he generally does it exactly the same way every time. For example, there's a lesser-known theory that Leorio and Benolt are from the same town because their flashbacks in the 2011 anime show them wearing very similar clothing and being in the same dystopian poor environment. Essentially the exact same evidence that we're using for Chrollo's connection to Oito. And that's because when Togashi draws poverty, he's not focused on depicting exactly where that poverty is happening. He's more focused on conveying the feeling. The location itself doesn't matter. It's the state of being. And so Togashi has developed a very standard aesthetic, which generally involves children wearing light scruffy clothes, usually shorts, in bare barren environments that almost look quite desert-like. And each and every time he depicts a new location of poverty, they are all essentially interchangeable with one another. They could all be one place, maybe it's all just Meteor City, but it's more likely that these are all separate places joined by Togashi's preferred depiction of poverty. In fact, Gyro is another example of this. His poverty backstory location is completely indistinguishable from anyone else we've mentioned. And what's more interesting is that specific Leorio theory doesn't even work because his hometown was never depicted in the manga. What we see in the 2011 anime is their interpretation of Leorio's childhood, which I find funny because it means that what they did was just lift from Togashi's signature poverty style. So how much real meat is there on the Chrollo-Oito relation? Well, I'd say about a chicken wing. Enough meat to chew on and enjoy, but nowhere near enough meat to thoroughly satisfy. Which is why you always need a pile of wings. One wing does not do it. It's entirely possible, but it relies on questionable evidence and a lot of convoluted connections. And the main reason why I think some people buy it is less because of the actual evidence available and more because of the future potential. I genuinely love the idea of Kurapika ending up saving Chrollo's family, whether it was intentional or not. But I also love the situation as it's currently set up now. Not everything needs to connect, and what I really like about Hunter x Hunter is that it doesn't have small world syndrome. It's not Star Wars where everything ends up being connected to a Skywalker in some way, shape, or form. I mean, yes, you do have your family dynasties like your Zoldycks, your Neteros, and your Freaks, but for the most part, Togashi well and truly embraces a more realistic approach to characters, and no matter what the case turns out to be, I look forward to seeing more from all of the above.